Welcome to The Hypnotist, the show that gives you inside access to cutting-edge hypnosis with real clients facing genuine issues. Brought to you by the hypnotherapist demanded by celebrities, CEOs, and even royalty, Adam Cox. These recordings took place live from Adam's clinic in London's world-famous Harley Street. This podcast features powerful hypnosis, so do not listen while driving or operating machinery. This recording is not suitable for those with epilepsy or severe mental health issues. So, get yourself comfortable and enjoy today's episode of The Hypnotist.
Hello, it's Adam here, and in this episode of The Hypnotist, I'm not going to do a hypnosis session, so if you are interested in actually listening to hypnosis, probably worth just kind of finding a different track to listen to. There's about 500 of them to choose from. I thought in this particular one, because I'm away from my studio, the sound quality isn't as good as it would be when I've got my professional recording equipment. So actually, a few people have sent me some questions over the last few weeks about depth of hypnosis, questions about trance. So I thought I would take the opportunity to actually, rather than reply to the emails individually, just do a podcast episode about some of the most popular questions about trance and trance states. Therefore, I can answer not only those few people that have been emailing me, but anyone else that might also have these kind of questions about what is a trance and how it works and that kind of stuff. So, so I'm going to go through them one by one. I've collated several questions across multiple emails. And the first most obvious question is, what is a trance? There are many theories about a trance. One of the big debates in hypnosis is the state versus non-state debate. The argument is hypnosis a unique state? And the problem with that is that it's very difficult to measure. It's largely a subjective experience, even with MRI scans and things like that. But I like a particular definition of trance. I use it. I think it's a useful definition, as any model is. A model is only as useful as its usefulness, really. So my definition of trance is that the average human can focus on or pay attention to about 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information at any one point in time. So if you think of your individual situation right now, there is lots of things that you could be giving your attention to. It could be the feeling of your feet in your shoes. It could be the breathing rate. You could be thinking about the last time you blinked. There's literally unlimited things that you can think about. But in, I think it was 1956, a psychologist called Miller, originally thinking about short-term memory, measured that we can hold on to about 7 chunks of information at any one point in time. The plus or minus 2 is because you get some people that can hold on to slightly more chunks of information, so about 9, and other people a bit less, about 5. But the average is about 7 chunks of information. So right now, for example, you might be paying attention to the sound of my voice. You might also be paying attention to, let's say, your breathing or something else. But you can't pay attention to 20 things simultaneously. So one of the ideas of trance, and the definition that I like about trance, is this idea that every sense that you have that is possible to experience in reality, you can experience internally. And a good example of that is if I say, right, what can you see in front of you right now? Then whatever you can observe with your eyes is your visual sense. But if I said, do you remember where you went to school or what your earliest birthday memory was? That's likely to also create a visual representation in what we would call your mind's eye. So you can see things in reality, but you can also see things internally. The same is true with auditory information. So you're hearing my voice right now through your ears, but if I said, think of a popular nursery rhyme, you might be making a little kind of rhythm, a little sound, hearing words inside your own inner ear, your inner voice, for example, self-criticism. All these things are the auditory sense, but going inwards. So you can have external senses, you can have internal senses. And the same is true with physical sensations. You can feel things. You can feel things that aren't actually there. And we know this to be true because there are people that have had body parts amputated that can still feel sensations in limbs that don't exist anymore. So phantom limb syndrome, for example, that's worth Googling if you're interested in the idea of how can you possibly feel sensations that aren't actually there. Well, you can do. So all of those senses that exist in reality can also exist within your mind. And of those 7 chunks of information, if the majority of those chunks of information are inwards rather than outwards, I think that's a useful definition of trance. So if I see people, I live in London, I see people on the London Underground, and they look like they are in a very deep trance state. You can see them holding their mobile phones, and they're lost in the moment, and they're certainly not aware of their external reality, like what's actually happening in the real world. They're lost in their own thoughts. Sometimes if you're reading a really good book, for example, you're creating an inner representation of that story. You're not even aware that you're turning the pages. So I think that's a useful definition of trance, when the majority of your senses are focused inwards rather than outwards. Now, there are hypnotic phenomenon that give us clues as to a trance state. Things like time distortion, things like arm catalepsy, so your arm doesn't move, different things, sometimes amnesia, different elements of things like that give us clues. They're hypnotic phenomenon that give us clues of a trance state. So that's kind of useful, if that makes sense. The other question is, are there any myths about trance? I think the biggest myth is that if you're in a trance that you can be controlled by someone. And the reality is, as humans, we enter trance states all the time. This isn't a one-off thing that requires a hypnotist. You will enter a trance state on a regular basis. If you have a long drive, for example, you won't recall changing lanes, you won't recall every moment of that journey, because a lot of your attention is inwards. And think about this: if you can drive like a 1 to 2 ton vehicle largely on autopilot, then what are you capable of in other things? This is a dangerous thing to do, but your mind is so confident in your unconscious mind to largely drive that vehicle for you that you can daydream about all kinds of different stuff while you're driving and still do that safely. But you would break out of a trance state rapidly if the weather suddenly changed, or if the car in front of you suddenly slammed on the brakes, or there was a traffic jam ahead. Then you would go from that trance state into a fully alert, what you would call a mindful state, rapidly. And for me, the trance and mindfulness are two opposite ends of a spectrum. When you're fully mindful, you're 100% focused, or as largely as you can get, on real sensory experiences. That's why it's called mindfulness. And a trance state is largely on the other end of that spectrum, where the majority of your sensory focus is on inward senses rather than external senses. So I think one of the key myths about trance is that you can be controlled. That certainly isn't the case. You can be influenced, but you can be influenced in real life. You can be sold something by a skilled salesperson without really wanting to buy that thing. You can be influenced into oversharing by a good communicator. So trance is not required to control anyone. Part of being a human is that there are multiple levels of influence that have nothing to do with hypnosis, like the the law of reciprocity. For example, if someone does something nice to you, you feel obligated to do something nice for them. The law of authority or compliance, that if someone that looks authoritative, looks like a police officer or from the military, and they command you with a certain tonality, you're highly likely to do that, much more likely, in fact, than if a hypnotherapist makes a suggestion. So I would say a bigger threat to this idea of being controlled, it isn't hypnotherapists you would need to worry about. It would be incompetent people in authority. That's the real danger. That if someone is in a position of power, then people are more suggestible quite often than a very skilled hypnotherapist, and not all people in power are ethical or act out of integrity. So if it's control you're worried about, then look to the authorities around you. Head teachers, police officers, politicians, they're much more dangerous. Another question, do you need to be in a trance for hypnosis to work? It's a very common question, and a lot of people really have a belief system that in order to be hypnotized, they have to be in a trance, and their own definition of trance isn't that the majority of their senses is focused on inward sensory experiences. It's that they have no memory of it. They feel completely out of control. So if that's your belief system, that in order for hypnosis to be effective, you need to be in a trance, and you've got this altered definition of trance, then you're going to arrive at the conclusion that because you didn't experience this kind of very unusual state, therefore the hypnosis won't work. And ironically, that is a hypnotic suggestion that you're giving to yourself based on a belief system. So a trance is not necessary for hypnosis to work. One of the great definitions of hypnosis is that it's linking a suggestion to an emotional state. Therefore, the trance isn't required. I like using trance states because it's sometimes more eloquent and efficient to create powerful changes. But is it necessary? Totally not. And I work with a lot of phobics. One of my brands is called Phobia Guru. You can check out that website, phobiaguru.com. Worked with hundreds and hundreds of phobics. And typically in session one, there is no suggestion to, close eyes and go in a deep, feeling of relaxation. Because actually, the phobic response itself in many ways is like a post-hypnotic suggestion, that when you see that thing, you feel that emotion. And therefore, I need them to be in a highly alert waking state. Sometimes I will ask for memories to see if the memories can evoke the same emotion. And in a lot of phobics, they can. So I'll say, what's the first time you remember meeting a bird, for example, or seeing a bird and having this sensation? And then they go back in their memory. And if they can still feel anxious at the memory, that gives me a lot of clues as to the strategy, the way in which they create anxiety from that stimulus. Normally it's things like attention, proximity, movement, things like that. So do you need to be in a trance for hypnosis to work? Absolutely not. You do not. It's simply not true. And actually, for unskilled hypnotherapists, if in their pre-talk they don't manage that expectation as to what is required for the hypnosis to be effective, quite often at the end of that hypnosis session, the actual client will say something along the lines of, I felt really relaxed, but I don't think I was hypnotized. Now, if for them, their definition of hypnotized is not met, and they also have the belief system that to be hypnotized is required for the change to work, then the hypnosis is not going to be effective. And I think there's a lot of hypnotherapists that don't realize just how important that pre-talk is in order for the hypnosis session itself to be effective. In my personal opinion, the hypnosis is starting way before the actual session. It's the beliefs, the perceptions they're creating about the hypnotherapist when they get a word of mouth referral, or they have a look at their website, or they see them online, or they schedule that first Zoom call or phone call. All of these things are starting to build a sense of confidence in the hypnotherapist. And I think as a result of my podcast and all the YouTube content I've created, the majority of clients that see me already have absolute confidence in my abilities as a hypnotist, because they can just scroll down Spotify or Apple Podcasts and see that I've worked with over 500 clients that have been the podcast episodes. And if they check out a few different websites, they can see that I've been doing this very proficiently and to an intense level, and therefore that gives them confidence, because the reality is a lot of hypnotherapists aren't seeing many clients. So therefore the beliefs that they're creating even before they schedule a consultation call with me are helping to make the hypnosis itself more effective. It's even more effective, by the way, if you get a word of mouth recommendation, because then that friend or family member that has recommended you itself is a part of the hypnosis, because there is a convincer strategy, there is evidence as to the competency even before they reach out to you, which is why you do want to have some kind of word of mouth or referral strategy as part of your business client acquisition plan, so that the more clients that see you as a result of, let's say, organic, so word of mouth or searching online, is much more effective than paid advertising. Because the pretense of a paid advertising is that you're only in front of them because you've paid to be in front of them, and therefore there is an element of a belief system of it being self-serving and therefore less credible. Like the majority of people don't believe adverts, for example, which that creates an issue. So that key question of, do you need to be in a trance for hypnosis to work? Absolutely not. And there are so many more things that are important than the trance in the hypnosis process. So effective diagnostics, rapport for me is more important than trance. Can the client that you're working with truly have confidence that you understand their problem? That itself, if you demonstrate that you really understand their problem, that is more effective than how deep the trance is. Which leads on to the next question. Does a deeper trance make the hypnosis more effective? And again, the answer is no. There are certain things that tend to induce a deeper trance. So if you're dealing with events that took place a long time ago, for example, then you're accessing memories, then the level of disassociation just based on time can create a deeper trance. If you're asking a client to jump in and out of waking state to trance state, which again quite often I will do if I'm dealing with an addiction or a habit, and I'll say, right, now tell me what you're doing, try and access that state again, close your eyes, and that would be known as fractionation. So going in from a waking state to a trance state, if you think of kind of the Elman induction, for example, if you're a hypnotherapist, you'll be familiar with that. What helps to create the trance state is this idea of going in and out of waking to trance, and that effectively helps to create a deeper trance. So you don't need the Elman induction to create feelings of or the state of fractionation. Sometimes actually a deeper trance makes it less effective depending on the need to calibrate. So if you really need to enter their world and figure out what they're thinking in a particular sequence, and I find that with anxiety, quite often there is nuanced thoughts almost like a row of dominoes, that one triggers another domino, triggers another domino. That actually, if they're in a really deep trance, you're relying on very subtle idiomotor responses to calibrate. Whereas if they're more like in a waking state, then you can catch them mid-thought. So if they're starting to do inner dialogue, and they say, yeah, but then I say to myself, blah, 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 and you catch them, then it's easier for you to figure out what's going on under the bonnet, because you can calibrate more information. You've got more information that you can apply the sensory acuity to figure out what's going on, and therefore make the change in the right place. So does a deeper trance make it more effective? No. But for certain types of hypnosis, a deeper trance can really be helpful. So for example, if I don't do a lot of past life regression, but if I do, then you really do want a deep trance state, because the premise of past life regression is that this didn't happen in your lifetime. So you would have lighter trance states if you're working with, let's say, a habit, or let's say someone's emotional response to criticism, for example. You would want a waking state. If you're dealing with, let's say, some kind of response to trauma that happened many years ago, or even past life regression or parts therapy, then that kind of stuff is quite useful to go into deeper trance, and just almost like the depth of the trance is a side effect by you having much more of their attention focused on things that doesn't exist in the present or the near present. So if you're asking them to recall details of memories from a long time ago, the majority of those 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information have to be internal, because they're not physically around in that moment, and therefore that tends to create a deeper trance state. Hoping all this makes sense. Can you ever get lost in a trance is another question. And it kind of echoes the next question as well, which is what happens if you don't wake up from hypnosis. So I'm going to answer both in hopefully a reassuring way. Can you get lost in a trance? Well, there's 2 different ways of doing that. So the first one, can you get lost in a trance? You can lose your chain of thought, absolutely, in the same way that you can do that in a waking state. You can be mid-conversation and then forget what you were thinking of or saying of, and you can lose your train of thought. In a dream, your mind can flit from one, kind of premise to an entirely different premise. So you could be naked at school one moment and then feel like you're falling the next. So, in terms of getting lost from a linear narrative, of course you can. You can do that in a waking state or a trance state. Can you get to a position where you can never return? No. I mean, this is Hollywood myth. This idea that if you go into a deep trance, that is it. It's going to be like that way forever. There are certain things that I think people get confused, and that is a trance state, which you can kind of enter in and out fairly fluidly, and fractionation gives us evidence of that. I've had sessions when I was working in Harley Street in central London where mid-session there might be a knock at the door and someone's knocked on the wrong door, and that hasn't interrupted the session, or there might be, because it was central London, quite often you'd hear sirens outside and things like that. So there's this idea of, can people, be thrown out of a trance state and then it doesn't become effective, and that kind of stuff. And all of this is largely nonsense propagated by incompetent therapists. But this idea that Hollywood would have us believe that you could, be hypnotized and never wake up again is pure nonsense. The absolute worst case scenario is that you would drift into a sleep and you would wake up when you're ready. Like, that's the absolute worst that can happen. The difference between that and a post-hypnotic suggestion, however, is very different. And a lot of what hypnotherapy is actually unwiring pre-existing hypnotic suggestions that are already there. So, for example, if you were, let's say, if you grew up in a family where your money wasn't safe. That if you had any savings, a parent or a sibling would take that money and spend it from you. Okay, let's say you grew up in a family like that. Then a neural pathway connected to emotion was created at that point, and it's highly likely to have created an ongoing post-hypnotic suggestion, which is, if you have money, it's not safe anyway, so better to spend it. And then just imagine that you're now a full-grown adult, but you grew up in that family home where your money wasn't your own really, it could be spent at any moment, and then suddenly you have a large increase in the amount of money that you have. Let's say you win some money, you inherit some money, or you get a bonus from your work. It's highly likely that because of that conditioning that you had in childhood, you're going to unconsciously spend that money as rapidly as you can, because your belief system at a subconscious level is that if I have money, it's going to be taken away from me. Now, nobody would consider that that individual was in a hypnotic trance all the way from childhood to adulthood and that. But you could say that it is a form of a post-hypnotic suggestion, even if that was self-hypnosis that created there in childhood, where they just arrived at a conclusion that if I have money and I don't spend it, someone else will. Now, that belief system might have been very useful in a family home where you couldn't trust your family. Probably not so useful if you're then in a family where, people can't just take your money away. So that would be more like a post-hypnotic suggestion. So do you ever really wake up from that kind of, those thoughts, those beliefs? No. Every human is walking around with a lifetime of beliefs, experiences, values, judgments, internal rules. That's what makes us human. But we don't consider that the entire population of the world is hypnotized, although depending on your definition of hypnosis, you could argue that point. I find it more useful to believe that we are all a work in progress. We have ways of thinking that are incredibly useful for us, and we have ways of thinking that may have been useful at one point in time that are no longer useful, but we've still got the programming. And I find it fascinating that we will happily accept that our mobile phone operating system needs to be updated at least 2, 3, 4 times a year, but we don't ever question the belief systems, the operating system of our own mind, because most adult humans are running around with code that was installed when we were children, and we're still acting out from those habits, those beliefs, those judgments, those rules. And that's why I think hypnotherapy is such a vital, important role, because unlike other therapists, if you think of counselors, if you think of psychoanalysts, for example, they're very much non-directive. And what that really means is that their intention is not to intervene, is not to make changes, but just to listen and reflect, so that hopefully the client figures out the changes they need to make and then makes them. My belief system is that if the client already knew how to make the changes, they wouldn't need to see a therapist. That's my belief system. And then you get, on the other end of the spectrum, people that are from this background of hypnotherapy or NLP, which is very interventionists. The intention is to make rapid changes, and quite often those changes can be content free. We don't need to know about the painful memory. We don't need to know about the history, and that has 2 advantages. One, you don't have the possibility of creating false memories that quite often can happen if you spend hours and hours and hours talking about painful moments from the past. You can literally implant memories in people's childhood where they start thinking they were abused when they weren't. So you avoid that. Secondly, the goal is to create change rapidly. And one of my values, and it comes really from someone I used to know when I was at school, and she had been learning to drive for a long time, and she had something like 30 or 40 lessons, And I was asking her about it, and I said, when are you going to get your license? When are you going to take your test? And she said, my driving instructor doesn't think I'm ready yet. And I remember thinking, this driving instructor clearly is trying to extract as much money from her as possible by delaying the time it takes for her to do a test. That was my belief system. So one of my values that I have as a hypnotherapist is, and the reason why I operate with the speed and efficiency that I do, is that I never want to be the hypnosis equivalent of a bad driving instructor. I would rather create rapid change for someone in just, a few sessions, sometimes even just a single session. And even though there might not be that much money coming from that individual client, what tends to happen is that what I lose from income from that client, I get back in word of mouth recommendations. Because then essentially what they end up saying to their friends and family members is, he's expensive, but he's quick. You get results. The changes are rapid. And I like that kind of feeling I get from almost like the psychological equivalent of being a magician, that you can create transformational change rapidly. So that final question, what happens if you don't wake up from hypnosis? Complete nonsense, you would just fall asleep. I think the bigger question is, in many ways, we're all living a life from the hypnosis that was installed to us in children. And actually, if you bought a house with wiring that was very useful 100 years ago, but you're now living in the present day, you might hire an electrician to rewire that home to make it useful for the current, ways of living, in a home that needs air conditioning and Wi-Fi and lots of, technology around. You probably wouldn't tolerate a new home with old-fashioned wiring. And I think a lot of humans are walking around with wiring that was there from childhood that may be useful for an update. This isn't a sales pitch in any way, but if you are listening to this thinking that maybe you have, let's say, beliefs that were installed in childhood that aren't useful anymore, or that you would, maybe you've got a problem and you want to, work on that problem, there will be a link nearby for you to book a completely free 30-minute consultation call, and I can just explain how I would work with you, and in fact figure out if I'm the right person to work with you at all, because it may be that actually I know many hypnotherapists that are good, that I can just refer you to someone else other than me. But if I feel like I can help, then I would let you know what it would cost to work with me. Like I say, not a sales pitch, but it would be weird for me to, talk about all of this kind of stuff and then not provide a call to action for those people that might have something specific that they want to work on. Hope you found this useful. I know it's a different type of episode from my normal hypnosis, but I get these questions about trance states a lot. Hopefully you've got your questions answered. If you haven't, I'm more than happy to do a follow-up with any further questions, so just drop me an email, adam@adamcox.co.uk. if you've got any further questions about trance or anything like that. More than happy to do more content like this if you find it useful. Equally, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, you know what, this is horrible, Adam, stick to just doing the hypnosis sessions, I'll happily take the feedback. Drop me an email as well. Let me know what you think. Again, adam@adamcox.co.uk. I want this podcast to be useful for you. If you find this useful, let me know. If you don't find it useful, also let me know, because I treat my podcast like I treat hypnosis, and that is calibration makes it work. So a feedback loop from you to me will make this podcast even better. Thank you for listening, and see you again soon.
Thank you for listening to The Hypnotist with Adam Cox, the show that gives you inside access to cutting-edge hypnosis with real clients facing genuine issues. To automatically receive the latest episodes, please subscribe. If you'd like to support the show, please share this episode with just one friend you think it could help. And if this episode helped you, please leave us a 5-star review.